Hello, welcome to Lessons of Vietnam. I'm your host, Bill Dixon. I hope you're recovering from the elections last night, and hopefully you got what you wanted out of it. A lot of folks didn't. A lot of folks are happy, and a lot of folks are sad, but that's the way the elections go, I guess, sometimes. Tonight's show is actually a gentleman I knew and thought a lot of, who is no longer with us. His name is Dan Pitzer. He was a POW. We've had some other POWs to come in and talk to us on the show. Those POWs were actually spent time in Hanoi Hilton. Dan and the two other gentlemen he was captured with spent their POW time in the jungles of Vietnam with the snakes and the bugs and the mosquitoes and the leeches and everything else in tiger cages, hanging from the air sometimes or on the ground. But before we get started, I want to invite you to call in at 919-518-9773 to ask your questions or be on the air. Or if you even better, if you go to computers 2K, that's K as in kilo, voice, like the voice show, on Skype, and log in with your name and be part of the show. If you want to reach out to me later, email at lessonsofvietnam@ncbvi.org and tell me what you liked about the show, what you didn't like about the show, any recommendations. Tell me you want to be on the show. That's even better. Tell me you want to be on the show. Sometimes I have to struggle to go out there and find guests, especially this time of year where everybody's so busy and so forth. But I'd love to have you on the show, tell your story. If you're a Vietnam vet, war protester, somehow involved with Vietnam, I'd love to have you on the show and so forth. Again, tonight we're going to be talking about a gentleman by the name of Dan Pitzer. He was, as I mentioned, he was not at Hanoi Hilton. He was captured in the jungles. In fact, he was captured south of Saigon, and down in that area, there's nothing down there but water and swamps and jungle and more water and swamps. There ain't a whole lot to walk on down there, but that's where they were captured. Dan Pitzer, next slide. This is a picture of Dan, and this is a quote he had in Look magazine. "I will never again be the same after being the animal called POW." Most people wouldn't even treat the animals as bad as the prisoners who were in the tiger cages. Dan was a sergeant, a medic. He went with another man that is very special to me, is Nick Rowe, who was a first lieutenant. And then the group was led by Captain Rocky Versace. Now, Rocky was not even supposed to be there, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute and so forth. Command Sergeant Major Daniel L. Pitzer was born on November 23rd, 1930 in Fairview, West Virginia. He joined the National Guard and graduated from high school or public schools in 1950. He joined the National Guard. Staff Sergeant Pitzer joined the active Army on December 10th, 1947. Leaving active duty on June 22nd, 1949, and then returned to active duty November 6, 1949. And I'm not going to read all this to you, but you can see that he was involved with the war in Korea and spent some time in Germany and so forth. He received his airborne wings on his 21st birthday. He had been sent back to Fort Bragg and got his jump wings on his 24th birthday. He was assigned to airborne Corps Artillery as a communication team leader. He was sent back to Germany for a while, and then he was sent to Japan for a brief time, and then he ended up back with the 82nd Airborne in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And Sergeant Pitzer, or Dan, completed the Special Forces training and then served with the 5th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg from December 1961 to August 1963. Then he was deployed to South Vietnam from August 1963 until he was captured by Viet Cong forces and taken as a prisoner of war on October 29, 1963. So he wasn't in Vietnam a whole long time before he was captured. Let's see, we should be on page 3. That too. There you go. That's it. Okay, he spent 1,475 days in captivity in South Vietnam. Master Sergeant Pitzer was released on November 11th, 1967 by the Viet Cong. And there's 2 versions of that story, which we'll go over to in just a moment. He was a prisoner for 4 years. Again, as I mentioned, he was a prisoner with Nick Rowe. On November 11th, after 4 years of torture and suffering from beriberi, malnutrition, malaria, hepatitis, and have lost more than 85 pounds, he was returned to U.S. control. And upon his return, he was at Fort Bragg at Walmart Hospital for 8 months. He spent in the hospital there. Kind of give you some ideas of his decorations and so forth. Okay, let me go back, see if I skipped something here. Yeah, I did. Okay. Following his release from, I'm good, thank God, Amnon keeps up with me because sometimes I don't know where I'm at. Following his release from the hospital, he served in both the 6th and 5th Special Forces, and then he was assigned to the Army JFK Military Assistance Command there, and he also was very active, and he and Nick Rowe, after Nick was escaped from the same captors that he was released from and came back and spent his time in the hospital, they got together and started the Survival, Evasion, Rescue, Resistance, and Escape School for the Navy, the SEER training. And up until the time that Nick died, he was still working at Fort Bragg with the Kennedy Special Warfare Center and the SEER School there, because they really was very special in his heart, teaching people how to survive being a POW, the pilots and so forth. Some of the decorations he had was Silver Star, Bronze Star, Legion of Merit, Purple Heart, Meritorious Service, Prisoner of War, Good Conduct, National Defense Service, Korean Service, Vietnam Campaign with 60 devices, United Nations Service, Overseas Ribbon, Meritorious Units Commendation, Master Parachutist Badge, and Combat Infantryman Badge. Now, what led to Dan Pitzer becoming a POW in the jungles of Vietnam for 4 years? Sometimes he was in a cage 3 feet by 4 feet to live for long periods of time, and sometimes they had him in cages with Nick, and sometimes with Rocky. There was just almost not enough room for the 3 of them. There were, and if I can tell you, in the jungles of Vietnam, the mosquitoes, the leeches, all kinds of bugs and spiders and everything else crawl all over you. It's not exactly the thing that you want to go through. Not to mention you lay on the dirt and so forth, and during the rainy season, hiding where you keep from getting all kinds of diseases, laying in the mud and so forth. Now, how did he end up there? Kennedy had a thing going with the Pentagon. He took the special forces away from the CIA and put it with the military. And the United States Army Special Forces Provisional was formed in Saigon, Vietnam in 1962. They were tasked to advise and assist the South Vietnamese government in organizing, training, equipping, and support civilian irregular defense groups, better known as SIDGs. Now, the SIDGs were the local peasants and people of South Vietnam who they formed and got together and kind of formed civilian groups where the special forces came in and trained them, give them weapons, and live right there with the civilian forces. In 1963 of July, special forces were given complete control over the SIDGs, and training and working with the South Vietnamese people, and like I said, living out in the villages with them. The United States Provisional SIDG network consisted of 45 strategic location camps, each one with an airstrip. In other words, all over South Vietnam, they would set up these camps and have an airport. What they would like to do is anywhere the Ho Chi Minh Trail they could put a camp, they put one up. Now, The problem with that is you go out in the middle of a jungle along the Ho Chi Minh Trail where all the communists are coming down from the north, and you set up a small camp there. They were always apt to be overrun or attacked and so forth. But they developed the programs, and the programs soon involved into combat because of where they were and so forth and what they were doing. Whenever they went out with the SIDGs, they ended up having to be in fighting anyway. Two of the camps that we're going to be kind of talking about a little bit was the two provisional SIDG camps was at Hep Wa, Detachment A21, Ton Phu, Detachment A23, which is the one that Nick and Dan were at. Their isolation location in the midst of unknown heavy enemy presence, as I said, making them very vulnerable to attack. On October 29th, 1963, Captain Rocky Versace, First Lieutenant Nick Rowe, and Sergeant Dan Pitzer went with the SID group on an operation along a canal. Now, the problem was that Rocky was not supposed to go out with the group because of his job and his rank. He was not supposed to go out with that group, but he insisted on going anyway, which he probably later wished that he had not gone. They left the Special Forces camp at Ton Phu for the village of Liquor, just around a small commerce. Were taking over the village to check out where the commerce were taking over a small village. I believe they left like 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that. And this is a story that Dan told Look Magazine's reporter Warren Rogers. Now, all of this report here does not always completely go along with the stories that Dan told. Don't know whether it was a memory thing or the official story was not something the real story was not something they officially want out. This is what Dan says, I'm quoting him. Going there was routine. We moved out at 3 in the morning of October 29th, 1963. Captain Humbert R. Versace, better known as Rocky, a U.S. Army advisor, and Lieutenant James Nick Rowe, and I, both members of the Special Forces, the Army's Green Beret, were with a company of South Vietnamese Army Special Forces probing the Viet Cong, or the SIDGs. Another company had left the Tan Phu before they did, 3 hours earlier than they did. That's at like midnight. And they were going to go on the other side of the village and do a blocking force, which is a plan we used quite a bit. When you were going into an area you thought were VC there, you'd put another group farther out so when they escaped from where you were shooting at them, that they would run into the other American soldiers. Now, again, they're down in the swamps and so forth with the leeches and mosquitoes and everything else. And routinely, we sloshed through rice paddies and swamps from our camp at Tan Phu in An Hoa province, just about as far south as you could go in the Mekong Delta. When we reached the village, there were no VC. That company that had left before they did, they decided to return back to camp, and they decided to do the same thing, but going back by a different route, which was also maybe something they shouldn't have done. On our way home, trudging along one of the many canals that crisscrossed the delta, we drew fire. We fired back and moved, but the closer we got to our base, the more VC we ran into. Soon we were surrounded. We radioed for artillery and air support, but the Viet Cong kept jamming our signal. That's the radio signals. We managed, however, to squeeze one message through. I did my best as a medic for the wounded. Again, Dan was a medic. And once they got to the point they saw that there wasn't a whole lot they could do, they ordered the South Vietnamese troops to pull back. And when they pulled back, it was not exactly an orderly. It was like panic. A lot of them threw their weapons down and ran. Some of them stayed and so forth, but it was pretty well unorganized. Captain Versace had lost his glasses and was having trouble seeing. Lieutenant Rowe had a small wound in his left thigh. It was impossible to tell how many VCs there were, but could see them coming on. We were grouped with a handful of Vietnamese, all that were left of the company, and withdrew about 70 yards to a canal. Just as I jumped in, the whole canal bank exploded. I looked up, and there was a VC with a 50 caliber K-50 submachine gun firing almost blank. I could see flames splitting from the muzzle, and I could hear bees swarming past my ears. Now, that's pretty close. A K-50 fires 35 round clip at a rate of 90 to 100 rounds a minute. How in the world Dan was missed was a story to itself, and finally he was able to shoot the guy. He left the canal and ran for a cane field. The VC spotted us and came running and firing. We were split up and confused. That happens the first time the first bullet goes out, the plans all go out the window, and you hope the guys are disciplined enough to do what they're supposed to do. We split up and I'm confused. I knew there was no hope in fighting our way out. I decided to swim for it. I dropped in the mud and buried my M79 grenade launcher, maps, and other gear so that the Viet Cong couldn't get a hold of it. I heard Captain Versace yelling that he was hit. I hesitated. I didn't want to be captured, but I could not run off on the captain. Just as I reached him, something exploded, a mortar round or a concussion grenade, and I was knocked down, shrapnel in my right shoulder. I looked up, and there was a VC with an automatic weapon pointed at me. He took away my .45 caliber automatic pistol and my wristwatch. He tied my hands behind me with a small towel that most Vietnamese peasants wear around their necks. Other VC came up and we started walking the canal path, and then we were running because mortar rounds were coming in. You know, that last report they got in before they got jammed, they started getting artillery rounds from that. The only problem was it was getting the good guys and the bad guys. So they started running and hiding from the coming in. It was also about 1,000 yards from them. There was another American group that never knew they were there. So they finally caught up with the VC that had Nick Rowe. They set him down, took off his shoes and his socks and blindfolded him. Kind of hard to run through the jungle barefooted. It's kind of hard to run through the jungle with boots on. Some of the when they went into a village, and some of the villagers there gathered around and shouting and throwing rocks at them and dirt and calling them names and poking them. The VC held them off and shoved me to a canal into what I found out later was a sandpan. As I fell, I cracked my ankle, my left ankle, against something and broke it. Until underway, I could hear aircraft strafing and bombing, and soon we were receiving artillery fire too. We pulled up and I was dragged to shore. Nobody knew about the prisoners being there. They had a spotter probably and didn't know about the prisoners there, so they were trying to strafe and bomb the escaping VC. When the planes went away, we got back in the sampan, moved the short distance on the canal, and again went ashore. The artillery was still coming in, and we're all made to lie down. The VC offered us rice, but he was too wrought up or too excited or whatever to eat. After it got dark and the artillery stopped, we moved along the canal to a little grass hut. From inside came the voice of Captain Versace hollering, "Bok Si, Bok Si," which is Vietnamese for doctor. The VC refused to let me help him, as Dan was saying. They tied Rowe and me together outside the building. The mosquitoes were fierce, and my ankle swelling badly was painful, and all the while I could hear Captain Rocky calling "Bok Si, Bok Si," trying to get some help, which they didn't give him for a while there. After 3 hours, they blindfolded Rowe and me, lashed us back to back, and put us into a sampan. We were delivered to a small camp built among tall, dense trees and surrounded by knee-deep mud. Along with Captain Versace, we were put into a small cage just big enough for the three of us. It was made of mangrove logs, nailed and tied and wrapped in barbed wire. They kept the VC kept the kerosene lantern going so they could always keep an eye on them. They put mosquito nets around them, which didn't a whole lot of good because the mosquito net's laying on you. The mosquitoes still get you, but the thought was there, I guess. Rocky's leg, or the captain's leg, had 3 rounds through it. One apparently penetrating the bone around the knee, and as he groaned with pain, he also had 2 flesh wounds in his back, which probably from the same grenade or mortar that got Dan. After about a week in the cage, we were taken out. Did I skip another part? I did.
No.
Well, finally they were able to send a medic in. Yeah, they sent a medic in to help Rocky Versace, and then finally they took him away to the VC hospital. After about a week in the cage, we were taken out again, blindfolded, hands tied behind their backs, under covering of straw mats, floated by sampan to what appeared to be a training camp. There were plenty of VC soldiers around. First, my hands were untied and blindfold removed, and I was forced to lie on the ground with a VC standing over me with a bayonet, as if he had just captured me. A photographer took a picture. Next, with our hands tied behind us, Roe and I were marched around by the youngest and smallest VC they could find when the photographer snapped away. Propaganda pictures. They brought out Cat Versace out of the makeshift hospital, and the three of us were posted in front of more propaganda pictures. At a later time, Nick and Dan were in one of the tiger cages in the jungle, and the Viet Cong came up and offered them some condensed milk to go with their rice. At the time that Dan was still having problems eating, but Nick said he would eat it with his rice. So they again took a picture of Nick in the tiger cage eating his rice with condensed milk. Sometime later, that photographer, the communist VC photographer, was killed, and the film was recovered, and for years and years and years, that picture of Nick Rowe eating rice with condensed milk in that tiger cage for some reason was in Dan Pitzer's 201 file, and finally one day Dan found it, and Ron Harris, one of our members and is a fantastic doodler or pen and ink artist, drew a picture of Nick in the tiger cage, which now hangs in the Pentagon. They traveled for 5.5 days, moving at night, sleeping by day. By slipping the blindfold and watching the stars, I could tell we were traveling south deep through the Yumen forest, and you can kind of get an idea of what the Yumen forest looks like with all that green swamp water. Closer to the southmost tip of Vietnam. In other words, if you got much closer, you're going to be in the ocean. We slept aboard the sampan, except for one day I remembered most uncomfortably we holed up in a cow shed and woke covered with leeches. Shivering in disgust, we pulled them off. One of the VCs burned off the still clinging heads with a cigarette. If you pull them off, the head's going to come off, and you've got almost instant infection, but the VC did take cigarettes and burn them off. Our new camp built of mangrove trees was high and dry, but surrounded by hostile terrain. We had plenty of water caught during the rains and stored in tanks, and plenty of crabs, fish, and shrimp, but none of us keep food down. Most of the 2 meals a day were wasted on me. Cat Versace was put into a hut the VC called a dispensary. Roe came down with amoebic dysentery, and they gave him shots, but he wasted away. He and I were together then in one of 2 wooden cages whose bars were interwoven with barbed wire, and each night we were put in leg irons to make sure they didn't get out of those cages. The leg irons, by the way, were made for the Vietnamese who got smaller legs and so forth than the Americans. In December of 1963, an interpreter suggested they write letters home to their families. But they were kind of suspicious of just what the letters were going to be sent to and what they're going to use, so they decided not to write letters, but they asked if they could send letters to the International Red Cross, which would eventually get the letters to their homes, and they did that. But about 3 weeks later, we were told the letters did not go through because they were through the International Red Cross and couldn't be used for propaganda. And we could still write our families, but they refused. I kept losing weight because I could not eat the rice. By the end of 1963, I was down to about 145 pounds from 185. I became so weak that I stood up quickly, I would pass out. I knew that to live, I would have to learn to eat the rice. I would force the stuff down, vomit, rest a while, then try again. Eventually, I began to manage and actually gained a few pounds. And Dan didn't go into a whole lot of details of how they were treated and so forth during this period of times, but they were received torture and basically disregarded. It's where he come up with the saying that he was treated like an animal, called a POW. Towards the end of January of 1964, it moved again. In the new camp, hidden in even denser forest than the last, we were isolated in wooden cages barely big enough for one man. We were told arrangements were being made to free us in exchange for prisoners. The VC questioned us, trying to get more than name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. We just sat there mute. In April, Captain Versace was taken away. Versace spoke several languages, French, Vietnamese, and he gave the communists absolute hell. He did whatever they told him to do. He did the opposite. They actually basically took him away and took him traveling around from place to place, showing him off. And from time to time, Nick and Dan would see someone they thought was Versace. He had gray hair at the time. When they saw him later, his hair had turned white. They did announce later that he was assassinated because he had given the communists such a hard time. He would argue with them, and he would argue with the communists when they would give him the propaganda stuff in front of other South Viet or Vietnamese people, and they didn't want the Vietnamese people to hear his arguments, so they eventually killed him. He was taken away. He was still pretty sick. Roe and I found from our separate cages, saw each other occasionally. We would wave, and that was about it. Around June, a VC officer told us that negotiations for prisoner exchange had collapsed. Now, for some reason, our guards gave us a 4th of July party. They cooked a chicken for us and produced some bread, the first I had seen for months. But first we had a propaganda speech and how the VC appreciated Independence Day, because they too were fighting for their independence. They would use just about anything they could to give prisoners a propaganda speech. They had propaganda meetings almost every day for the prisoners to tell them how wonderful the North Vietnamese communist system was. After that, they allowed us to meet once a week to talk. In other words, instead of being separated, they brought them together for their indoctrination. They were supervised by an interpreter. We managed to throw a few curves past him, however, by using a few words of German. They would talk, and the interpreter didn't necessarily know what they were doing. One old guard who had fought against the French in the Indochina War and loved to tell about was helpful. He scrounged up some pumpkin, and we ate them until they were practically coming out of our ears. They provided plenty of vitamin C, and soon I could literally feel the strength coming back into me. But then I suffered hepatitis, and they treated me with liver extract. I had several bouts of diarrhea for which they gave me sulfur quinine. Off they made propaganda pictures of us receiving injections. I mean, just about anything they could come up with, get a picture of for propaganda. In October, they expanded my cage and moved Roe in. Another American, Master Sergeant Edward R. Johnson, was put in Roe's old cage. It was tremendous to have someone around. For 8 months, I had only animals for companions. There was a squirrel. I called him Cyrano de Bergerac because he had an unusually long nose. He was hilarious. I fed him whatever I had, usually shrimp shells. On hot sunny days, he would perch on one of the logs of my cage and doze, batting his eyes and slumping, and finally topping over in a dead sleep. There was a cat, the only rice-eating cat I ever saw, which is why I dubbed him Victor Charlie for VC. A dog I christened Mao Zedong did not last long. He disappeared, and I can relate to that. He disappeared probably into someone's soup bowl because the Vietnamese fancy dogs, or like dogs, almost as much as monkey. We had monkey curry once, and it was good. We always tried to get a dog and get him up nice and healthy, and Mama San was all taking, we was taking him home for dinner, and he was not the guest. Early in December, the VC began building a third cage. The new arrival proved to be an Army Sergeant Leonard M. Thaddeus. He was wounded, and I asked if I could treat him. The VC would not let me go to Thaddeus, but Rowe convinced them that he should be allowed to. Like me, Rowe was barefoot and dressed in VC black pajamas. Now, both of these guys, Dan and Nick, were both a small stature, big in personality, but they were small in stature. Like me, Rowe was barefoot and dressed in black pajamas. Thaddeus refused to talk freely. He suspected, he told us later, that Rowe was a Russian advisor to the VC. Rowe eventually argued the guards into letting me look at Thaddeus, and I found a shrapnel wound in his left side and a piece of shrapnel in his left leg, too deep to be removed. Much later, when it had worked close to the surface, I cut out with a razor blade sterilized over a kerosene lamp flame. On December 23, 1964, an American L-19 observation plane zoomed over our camp and dropped red flare markers. That was when a bird dog, it's called a bird dog, and he found them and he put markers out so that the jets and the helicopters could come in. Helicopters came in firing rockets and machine guns. Our cage was open for feeding time, and Rowe and I ran for cover. 2 armed guards fell in behind us, and the 4 of us struck out across the mud and swamps for about 5 kilometers. That's a lot of running. We were often in the muck up to our waist, sometimes our necks. The helicopter stayed all day bombing and strafing. That night when we locked up again, we saw the camp had pretty well shot up. So not only were they POWs and the communists were treating them, but they were also subject to be accidentally killed by their own military as prisoners, because nobody knew they were there. All they saw was some communists out there in the middle of wherever. At 4 the next morning, the VC took us back to the swamp. We spent all day in the boats, returning to our cage at night. The days were the same, except that to celebrate Christmas, we each got 5 or 6 ounces of brown sugar candy. Johnson and Thaddeus, who had been locked in the cages during the raid, were also brought out, and it was the first chance we all had to get acquainted. Johnson had shrapnel wound in his right wrist from the helicopter rocket. Knocking around the swamp was depressing. It dramatized how hopelessly we were as prisoners, not as much of the VC as the terrain. Our physical weakness, our isolation, our unfamiliarity with the area. Even if VC had said, you can go, take off and go, we could not have made it unaided. That was the hell of it. Now, Dan told us a story about being out in the swamps like that. They were moving around all the time. He was despondent, he just basically ready to give up. They came out of the jungles into a clearing, and he says on the other side of the clearing was a perfectly lit Christmas tree out in the middle of jungles. Now here's a Christmas tree out in the middle of jungle. Even the VC, the communists, started mumbling about it and so forth. But when they got to the other side of the clearing and he saw what it was, the fireflies had formed what looked like a Christmas tree. And it says that's what gave him the strength to carry on, that there was something else out there, and that's what gave him the strength to carry on and continue being the POW. The VC moved us on December 26th, north about 5,000 meters to a dilapidated, apparently abandoned camp. My legs were numb and aching from berry. I could not keep my food down. And in February 1965, we moved again, traveling all night in an unusual way. It was a 5-day journey, this time to another temporary camp. I kept track of the time by calendar I grew on a cardboard taken from ammunition cans. It was accurate, except that I forgot 1964 was a leap year, and I was 1 day off for months until I remembered February 29th. Things improved at the new camp. A more permanent facility. The VC about 1,000 meters away. They put all 4 of us together, fed us pork, gave us vitamins and liver injections, and let us listen to the nightly English language broadcast by Radio Hanoi. Hanana. My brain and my mouth not working there. I picked up weight, and Johnson was eating well, but Thaddeus had little appetite and was losing weight. We passed the time playing cards with a deck I made from ammunition cardboard, and we talked a lot about our childhood, our families, and our hopes. Hanoi Hannah was the VC equivalent of Tokyo Rose or whatever, who did the broadcast of English language to the soldiers in World War II. But they played American music, and then, of course, told how the Viet Cong and the communist North Vietnam were winning the war, and how the protesters back home were doing, and all that sort of good stuff they shared. After a couple of months, they took Roe away. Then I got ill again, hardly able to walk. They stopped locking me up in leg irons at night because of rash from the iron around my ankles. In June 1965, Thaddeus made a break. He was gone for 3 days, recaptured. Now, you remember a while ago they were talking about, when he was talking about even if they got away, there was nowhere to go because the swamps and the jungles and food and water, fresh water, and so forth. But he was gone for 3 days, recaptured. He was put in a camp where Roe was held about 500 meters away. And in October, Thaddeus and Roe both made a break, but they were caught within 24 hours. They were physically wrung out when put back in with Johnson and me. The VC encouraged us to listen to Radio Hana's English Hanoi. I know I can say Hanoi, I've been there. English broadcast, and they did. This is how we learned that Captain Versace, along with Army Sergeant Kenneth M. Rohrbach, had been executed in retaliation for Saigon's execution of 3 VC terrorists in Da Nang. I had known Rohrbach, a fellow wearer of the Green Beret. We had made a trip together to Vietnam in July 1963. We argue with our captains about the cold blood and killings. They argue with them about killing Versace and Rohrbach. But you executed them. Why not execute us? The reply was, don't worry, you are not in danger of that because Saigon is not going to execute any more of our people now. In December 1965, we moved to a completely rebuilt camp run by a Viet Cong major. The guards told us we were now prisoners of something new, the Liberation Army. And they went out of the way to be friendly, which was instead of being the Viet Cong, now they were with the regular North Vietnamese military. By New Year's Eve, we were told the camp was too vulnerable to air attack, and we undertook a roving existence in the U Minh forest. We slept under ponchos, never more than a week in one place. Thaddeus was getting sicker all the time, and then we were joined by another very sick man, our Army Captain Orion J. Walker, Jr. I gave him vitamins and anti-malaria shots, but as we moved about, he weakened daily and soon became incoherent. He was taken away, supposed to a VC hospital, where we're told later he had died. It's hard to imagine what they went through out there, moving from day to day, never being in one place, never really getting much of the 2 meals they had a day were not very much because the communists who were had them prisoners, they also were not eating very well, moving around, never having a rest, never getting a day's break and so forth. It's a wonder all of them didn't come down with all kinds of disease and die right there from just what they went through. We were put to work in December building a camp. Roe, Johnson, Parks, Jackson, and I. Oh, okay, I did it again. Okay, sorry about that. I'm gonna back up. I jumped another part. I apologize for that. Another American Army Sergeant, Joe Parks, came to us in February of 1966. They'd already been captured about 3 years at that time. He had been held for about a year in a camp where meat and fresh vegetables were ample. Boy, what that group with Dan and them would have done for some meat and vegetables. He was healthy looking, even fat, but he began to decline almost immediately. Thaddeus too was slipping. I can't eat fish, he would groan, but he would vomit and try again. In July, we moved again. It was then that Sergeant James E. Jackson, Jr., another Green Beret, joined us. We all worked on Thaddeus, but he came down with amoebic dysentery in September and was moved to a VC hospital. Again, we were told later that he had died. And then another American Army Sergeant, Joe Parks, came to see us in February 1966. He had been held for about a year in a camp where meat and vegetables was ample. He was healthy looking, even fat. Oops, now I had already done that part twice. Okay, so you can no wonder I'm getting so mixed up.
Sorry.
It's all right. I got a cheat sheet here in front of me too. So I'm hoping you at home are keeping up. I'm going to have a test afterwards. We were put to work in December building a camp. Rowe, Johnson, Parks, Jackson, and I, as soon as we were finished, the VC moved us to an old rundown camp. In other words, the camp they fixed was for the VC cadre who were keeping them captive. They moved them to an old rundown camp. Security was tight. We were put together in a big building enclosed by barbed wire. At Christmas, the VC gave us chicken and 4 bottles of beer together with the inevitable propaganda speech. Parks was in bad shape. He had lost considerable weight and had anemic dysentery. On New Year's Eve night, I remember he said, "I can't take it anymore. I'm going to die." And on the morning of January 1st, 1967, Joe Parks died. The VC gave us a new set of pajamas for him. We put those on and wrapped him in a cloth, straw matting, and they took him out on a boat. They said they were going to bury Parks and notify the American authorities. And if you believe that, I got some lakefront property out in Arizona with oceanfront property. Excuse me. In March, they moved them to another new camp, the best yet. It had a vegetable garden, chickens, and even a pig. Security relaxed, and we were allowed to catch our own fish. Johnson was still very sick. He would have died if the VC had not supplied penicillin and streptomycin to fight his anemic dysentery. It was the first time that I had seen enough medication. Jackson, also a medic, took turns with me to attending to Johnson. We force-fed him until finally got him strong enough to move. In October, we were told we had been selected for release as part of an arrangement worked out with the Peace Committee in the United States. All we had to do, the VC said, was to write a letter asking us to be allowed to go home to our families. Now, this part I'm going over now was the official record of Dan's and Johnson and Jackson being released. I'm going to read you this one, and then I'm going to tell you what Dan told us. I'm not certain which one the truth is. I believe what Dan said. It may be a combination of the two. But this is what the official story was. Even though they totally disbelieved it, they wrote the letters. And on end of October, Jackson Johnson and I set out. We took message from Rowe, who was kept behind because he was an officer and more valuable trading material if they wanted to do more trades. If that was the VC motive, Raw thought of them, because a little over a year later he escaped, and that's another story for another show. And climaxed an incredible 5 years as president of the VC. The three of us, again, it was the three, Johnson, Jackson, and Pitzer, most of the time blindfolded, moved at night, hiding by day. Now, they weren't by themselves. They were led along by the VC who had captured them. Traveled north and west towards Cambodia. It took 2 weeks to reach the border. At first, that's the Cambodian border. At first by sampan and then by powerboat. We stayed there for a week. They gave us beef, my first in 4 years. We had canned milk and other marvelous things. Our guard, who had been with me throughout my captivity, gave us a goodbye party of beer and cookies. On November 10th, we went upriver by powerboat to Cambodia. We're then driven by car to Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. There, escorted by Royal Palace police, were taken to what to us was the palatial quarters. We each had a shower, a bathroom, a couch, and a bed with 2 sheets and a mosquito net. Well, after what they'd been through, that was super luxury. A Cambodian military doctor examined us, and somebody handed each of us the Cambodian equivalent of $5 and said we could buy anything we wanted. I bought shoes. The only thing I wanted, my first shoes in 4 years. So all that time through the swamps and everything else, he had been barefooted with the mosquitoes and the leeches and everything else, the briars and so forth. So he finally got himself a pair of shoes. The next day we were told to put on the khaki uniforms, white pants and white shirts were being given. We were taken to the home of the VC representative in Cambodia, and there we met Tom Hayden. Tom Hayden was anti-war agitator. He was Jane Fonda's husband at one time. He was big in the California government at one time. But he was, well, I'll tell you the rest of the story in a minute. The American who had negotiated our release with the VC. The three of us flew with Hayden west out of Phnom Penh to Beirut, Lebanon. Now, Nick is still back in the jungles there. There, an American official took us to the Hotel Phoenicia, where I began to comprehend for the first time the reality of my freedom. I had my first hot shower, a little scotch and some wine with a meal in our room. I ordered a Chateaubriand for two and ate the whole thing myself. The ride home from Beirut to Rome to Paris to New York to Washington to Fort Bragg is a blur now. I was so nervous and pepped up that I had all but passed out as I arrived at Fort Bragg. There waiting for me in my hospital room was my wonderful wife. I could hardly stand it. Yet the 4 years of suppressing emotions were not highly sloughed off. There were tears, but I was still masking my feelings. To my wife and the people around me, I must have seemed like a zombie. Even my wife told me that both my parents were dead, my mother a year after my capture, my father the following year. I did not react. It was not until I went home to West Virginia and they were not there that the full impact of my loss hit me, and that it hit me hard. Here's a man who, over the 4 years he was captured and gone through living hell, things went on, kept on going on back at home. He was a different person. His friends were different people. His wife was a different person. His mother and father were no longer there. A lot for a man to take in and comprehend and accept and so forth. Dan and Nick were united at Fort Bragg. They were instrumental in setting up the SEER Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape School, teaching people how to survive being a POW. That was something that Dan was very, very powerful and really loved doing, teaching other people how to do it. Nick had gotten out of the military, and which will be another show to tell you what happened to Nick after that. But Dan stayed in, and I think even after he got out of the military, he still worked there at the SEER School at Fort Bragg as a civilian and working with the troops and so forth there. He was a true hero, a patriot, a great man. I'm really honored to got to know him and talk to him and so forth and hear his story. Dan died in 1998. It's hard to believe it was that long. As a result of Agent Orange, and as far as the stuff that he had while he was the beriberi, dysentery, and all the other stuff he went through as a prisoner of war. Now, that was the story that was given to Look magazine. Now I want to tell you about the story that Dan told me and a couple of friends of mine. Johnson was still pretty sick. They put them on an airplane and flew them to, I believe, to Beirut, Lebanon, at which time Tom Hayden came on the plane and told them that if they would sign those letters of confession about what they had done to the Vietnamese people, the communists, how bad their government was and so forth, that they would be freed. If not, they would be sent back to Vietnam and back out to the tiger cages and so forth. From what I was told by Dan, was they told Tom Hayden what he could do with his confessions, and he left the plane. The communists took the three of them, put them in a bathroom, and had the cleaning crew to come on to clean the airplane, put new food and water and so forth on, and somehow or another they smuggled out a note saying they were American POWs held on the airplane to the cleaning people and asked them to give it to the American embassy. Well, the plane left Beirut and it landed in Lebanon for refueling or whatever. And when they landed, the American embassy came on the airplane, and because they were in a foreign country on a foreign airplane, they had to ask the three of them, do you want to be freed? And of course they did. And Dan Pitzer, the day he died, still hated Tom Hayden, even though Tom Hayden sent him a Christmas card, he said, every year. But there was no love lost for Tom Hayden for leaving on that airplane going back. But that's the story, the way Dan told it. Dan did say there was some parts of his story and Nick's story that they didn't all be. But going through what they're went through, I imagine it's hard that they could remember any of it to be able to sit down and currently tell the story to somebody else. The next show we're going to be doing, which is November 23rd, I'm going to be doing Nick Rowe's story. He was captured with Dan, as you know, but his story varies a little bit towards the end. He has quite a story himself. He was left in the jungles for another year. So we're going to be talking about Dan's story, and I hope to get around to doing Rocky Versasi's story. Rocky Versasi was recently, last year or two, was given the Medal of Honor for his part in what he did as a POW. Actually, when Nick Rowe was freed, he met Nixon at the White House and told them Nixon his story and what happened to him and so forth. And Nixon said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And he says, "Yes, get Rocky Versasi the Medal of Honor." And even though the President of the United States, Tricky Nick, was behind it, I guess the Watergate Commission and so forth kind of belayed that also. But up until recently, Rocky was just another POW to a lot of people. But the Special Forces Association and Special Forces people have always had a very special place in their heart for Dan, Nick, and Rocky. Both of all three of them stories, something that needs to be told. And then we're going to be coming up in the 1st of December. Our show is going to be, one of my guests are going to be on, curator with the North Carolina History Museum. They're trying to put together some things for the museum, Vietnam related and so forth. If you ever get a chance to come to North Carolina, or if you are in North Carolina, be sure and go by the History Museum. It's quite a place. North Carolina's got some fantastic museums here. One of the art museum is one of the best in the country. So he's going to be coming up in December, and I don't know what I've got for the next show yet. I've had several people who wanted to be guests. We're coming up, let's see, Friday. This is Wednesday. This coming Friday is a Veterans Day. Take time to go out and do something for Veterans Day. Go out and enjoy this wonderful freedom we have with your family and so forth. But when you do it, think about the men and women who put their life on hold, who went out and served this country, and the ones doing it today. Back in my day, we got a letter from Uncle Sam saying greetings. But today, these men and women step up and go, I'm going to put my life on hold. I could be out making a whole lot more money in private sector, but I want to go serve my country. And these young men and women all over the world serving us to keep us free. They're missing without their family. But go out and tell them thank you and show them some appreciation. Several of the restaurants around are having free meals on Veterans Day. If you're going to Golden Corral on Monday the 14th, you'll see a crowd because the Golden Corral every year serves veterans and so forth. But as we look on Veterans Day, think about what we're doing as far as why that holiday. As we talked about the last show, Memorial Day is where we thank those who died serving for this country. But Veterans Day is twofold. It honors the veterans who served as well as those who gave everything. So again, if you want to contact me and give me some input, email is lessonsofvietnam@ncbvi.org, and send me an email. Look in for the shows, tell your friends about it, and call in and give us some input. Or if you know Dan, Nick, or Rocky, either one, call in and give us information about it. As I go out and do research, even though I knew Dan, as I did research, one place said that Dan died in 1995. Another one said he was born in 1998. But if it's on the internet, it's got to be true. But this came out of Look magazine. And if you get a chance to do some research, go in and find that old Look magazine. It was in, I did have the date that was out there, but if you can look up for an animal called POW, which is basically the story of Dan Pitzer that was in Look magazine. And that's about our show tonight, and I appreciate you tuning in. Remember, Friday is Veterans Day. Go out and thank a veteran. Take them out and buy them a lunch or a beer or whatever you want to do. But at the same time, enjoy your family, because that's why they're a veteran, so that you can go out and be free to do the things. Thank you and good night.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. Our weekly lineup of call-in programs includes Computers 2K Now with Amnon Nissan, My Life, My Will with Gisela DiCarlo, The Tanya Love Show, Health Then with Debbie Bruck, Breaking Free with Marilyn Shannon, Triangle Be Well with Howard Jacobson, Lunch and Learn with Rabbi Yisrael Cutler, Lessons of Vietnam with NCVVI members, Current Affairs with Amnon Nissan. And if you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section on nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Atomos.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.